Some names appear where they shouldn't exist. Some records tell stories of people who were never there. In Raleigh, North Carolina, city archives hold documents that break every rule of time and place. The names are real, the dates are verified, but the people listed never set foot in the city. If you want to hear stories that challenge everything you think you know about American history, subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will change how you see the past. Raleigh sits in the heart of North Carolina, a city built on tobacco fields and political power, where oak trees line streets named after founding fathers, and brick buildings hold centuries of Southern memory. The State Archives building stands on West Jones Street, a fortress of concrete and climate control where every birth, death, marriage, and census record since 1663 waits in temperature-regulated silence. Inside those halls, archivists spend decades cataloging the ordinary rhythms of American life, cross-referencing names with dates, matching signatures to deeds, ensuring that history remains accurate and accountable. But in 2019, a routine digitization project uncovered something that shouldn't exist. A pattern so impossible that 3 separate teams verified the findings before anyone dared to speak about it publicly. The documents were real. The ink was period appropriate. The paper aged correctly. But the names belonged to people who had never been to Raleigh, never lived in North Carolina, some who had never even been born when the records were created. The discovery began with a marriage certificate dated April 1891, a simple document recording the union of 2 people in Wake County. Signed by a minister and witnessed by 2 local residents whose names appeared in multiple other city records from that decade. The bride's name was listed as Catherine Doris, age 23, born in Raleigh to parents whose names matched no census data, no property records, no church registries, nothing in any archive across the entire state. The groom's signature was clear and confident, but when researchers traced his name backward through time, they found him listed in a Chicago census 7 months after this wedding, unmarried, working as a clerk, with no mention of ever traveling south. The minister who performed the ceremony existed. His handwriting matched other documents. His church still stands on Fayetteville Street, but when researchers examined his personal journals from that year, there was no mention of this wedding, no entry for April 1891 that included these names.
The witnesses were real people, their signatures verified against property deeds and court documents, but neither ever mentioned knowing anyone named Catherine Doris, and both died decades later without any connection to this mysterious couple. The certificate itself passed every authentication test, the ink consistent with 1890s formulations, the paper watermarked with the correct manufacturer's mark for that period, the seal genuine and unaltered. But that was just the first document.
Within weeks, researchers found 16 more. A birth certificate from 1903 listed a child born to parents who, according to every other record in existence, were living in Boston at that exact time, running a bakery on Hanover Street, with witnesses who swore in legal depositions that the couple never left Massachusetts. A property deed from 1878 showed a man purchasing land on Hillsborough Street, his signature notarized and recorded, except that man had died in a Tennessee mining accident 4 months before the sale. His death certificate filed in Knox County with a coroner's signature and burial plot number. A voter registration card from 1912 bore the name of a woman who wouldn't be born until 1920. Her birth certificate on file in the same building, 8 years in the future, from her supposed vote. The pattern continued, each document authentic in every measurable way, each name attached to a person who couldn't possibly have been in Raleigh when the record claimed. These weren't clerical errors or coincidental name matches. Researchers verified middle names, ages, parent names, physical descriptions, occupations, all details that lined up perfectly with real people who were provably elsewhere. The documents crossed decades, spanning from 1871 to 1924, appearing in clusters with years of silence between them, as if whoever was creating them worked in careful, deliberate intervals. The first researcher to notice the pattern was named Michael Brennan, a state archivist who had spent 32 years cataloging North Carolina records, a man who prided himself on spotting forgeries and tracking down genealogical mysteries with the patience of someone who understood that history rarely reveals itself quickly. He was digitizing marriage records when he noticed the Doris certificate, and something about the bride's name triggered a memory of a Chicago census request he'd processed months earlier. He pulled both records, compared them side by side, checked the dates, verified the locations, and felt his stomach drop when he realized they were describing the same person in two places at once. He spent the next week searching for explanations, common names, misspellings, calendar errors, anything that could rationalize what he was seeing, but every verification only made the impossibility clearer. When he brought the findings to his supervisor, she assumed he'd made a mistake, but after reviewing the evidence herself, she ordered a full audit of every record in the database that showed similar geographic inconsistencies. That audit took 7 months and revealed 23 documents with the same impossible pattern, each one verified, authenticated, and absolutely unexplainable by any conventional logic. The state quietly assembled a team of historians, forensic document examiners, and genealogists, swearing them to confidentiality while they investigated whether the documents were elaborate forgeries or evidence of something far stranger. Every test came back the same. The materials were authentic to their claimed periods. The handwriting matched known samples from the officials who supposedly signed them. The storage conditions showed no signs of tampering or recent insertion into the archives. One forensic examiner noted that forging a single document to pass modern authentication would require extraordinary skill and resources, but forging 23 documents across 5 decades, each with period-correct materials and perfectly matched handwriting, would require a conspiracy so elaborate and pointless that it defied reason. The team interviewed descendants of the officials who signed the documents, searched for any family connections between the impossible names and Raleigh residents, investigated whether any secret societies or fraternal organizations might have created the records as some kind of elaborate ritual or code. They found nothing, no connections, no motives, no explanations that fit the evidence. The documents existed, the people listed were real but never present, and every attempt to solve the mystery only deepened it. Then someone noticed the dates. Not the dates on the documents, but the dates when they were filed. Every impossible record was filed on a Tuesday, every single one, across 53 years, always a Tuesday, never a Monday or Wednesday or any other day of the week. The pattern held without exception, from the earliest document in 1871 to the last one in 1924, 23 Tuesdays scattered across decades with no other obvious connection between them. Researchers plotted the dates on a calendar, looking for astronomical events, historical anniversaries, religious holidays, anything that might explain why these specific Tuesdays mattered. They found nothing astronomical, no eclipses or planetary alignments, no local events that repeated on those dates, no deaths or births of significant figures that connected them. The Tuesdays appeared random until someone cross-referenced them with old railroad schedules and discovered that each date corresponded to a day when a specific train, the Southern Railway's number 97, passed through Raleigh on its route from Washington to Atlanta. The train ran 6 days a week, but only on Tuesdays did it stop in Raleigh for longer than 10 minutes, a scheduling quirk related to mail sorting that lasted from 1869 until 1925, when the route was redesigned. Every impossible document was filed on a day when that train sat at the station, waiting, doors open, passengers moving between platforms in the brief window between arrival and departure. Was someone arriving on that train, filing false documents, then leaving before anyone could question them? The theory seemed plausible until researchers realized that most of the documents required multiple witnesses and official seals that couldn't be obtained in the few hours the train stopped. Property deeds needed lawyers, birth certificates required doctors, marriage licenses demanded appointments with county clerks, all processes that took days, not hours. Yet the documents were filed, signed, sealed, and recorded, always on Tuesdays, always connected to that specific train's schedule. One researcher suggested that perhaps someone who worked for the railroad was involved, carrying documents created elsewhere and inserting them into archives during brief stops. But that didn't explain how they gained access to official seals, how they convinced legitimate witnesses to sign, or how they predicted decades of scheduling for a train route that changed multiple times. The Tuesday pattern raised more questions than it answered, adding another layer of impossibility to an already inexplicable mystery. The investigation might have continued indefinitely, but in late 2019, the team discovered something that changed everything. A letter. It was filed in a miscellaneous correspondence folder from 1924, tucked between property tax inquiries and requests for census data, written on plain paper with no letterhead or return address. The handwriting was precise and formal, the kind taught in schools before typewriters became common, and the letter was addressed to the state archivist of North Carolina, a position that existed but was rarely used in official correspondence. The letter was dated Tuesday, September 16, 1924, the same date as the last impossible document in the collection. It read, "By the time you read this, I will have completed my work. 23 insertions across 53 years, each one a test of your systems, your attention, your ability to see what stands before you. I chose these people carefully, names of real individuals whose lives I studied from afar, whose existence in other places was documented and verifiable. I brought them here in paper form, gave them marriages and births and property in a city they would never see, created a shadow population that lived only in your records. You will find them eventually, perhaps years from now when your methods improve and your vigilance increases. When you do, know that I did this not for deception, but for proof. Proof that history is more fragile than you believe, that records can be trusted until they cannot, that the past you preserve is only as real as your faith in the systems that guard it. I was never caught because I was never careless. I am one person, working alone, with access you would never suspect, and patience you could not imagine. The train was my alibi, my schedule, my rhythm. Every Tuesday it brought me here, and every Tuesday I added another impossible truth to your perfect archive. You will search for my name, but you will not find it among the 23. I exist only in this letter, and by the time you understand what I have done, I will be gone from this world, leaving behind only questions and the uncomfortable knowledge that your history contains lies so perfect they became truth. The letter was signed with a single initial, the letter K. Subscribe now, because the mysteries buried in American archives are far stranger than any fiction, and this story is just beginning to reveal its layers. The team verified the letter immediately, and like the documents before it, it passed every authentication test. The paper dated to the early 1920s. The ink matched formulations used in that period. The handwriting showed characteristics of someone educated in the late 19th century. But the letter raised immediate questions that split the investigation team into opposing camps. Some believed it was a confession from the person responsible, a final gesture from someone who wanted their work acknowledged before death. Others argued it was too convenient, too perfectly timed, possibly a later addition by someone who discovered the pattern and wanted to create a false explanation. The handwriting didn't match any of the signatures on the impossible documents, suggesting either a different person was involved or the original forger had disguised their writing across decades. The mention of the train schedule was accurate, and only someone with deep knowledge of 1920s Raleigh would know about that specific timing quirk. The claim of being one person working alone seemed impossible given the complexity of creating 23 authenticated documents across 5 decades. But the letter's tone carried a confidence that suggested genuine authorship. Researchers searched every archive in North Carolina for other letters with matching handwriting, for signatures with the initial K who might have had access to official seals and witness documents, for any person who fit the profile of someone capable of this elaborate deception. They found nothing. No matches, no suspects, no evidence beyond the letter itself. The North Carolina State Archives eventually released a carefully worded statement acknowledging the discovery of anomalous documents that were under investigation, but the full details remained classified to prevent copycat attempts or public panic about archival integrity. The 23 impossible records were removed from public databases, marked with special codes that flagged them as disputed, though they remained physically stored in the archives under increased security. The letter from K was placed in a sealed folder, accessible only to senior researchers with specific clearance. Michael Brennan, the archivist who discovered the pattern, retired in 2021 but continued to research the mystery independently, convinced that K was real and that somewhere in the vast paper trail of American history, there were clues to their identity. He created a private database tracking every person with the initial K who worked in or near Raleigh between 1871 and 1924, cross-referencing them with railroad employment records, government positions, legal professions, religious organizations, anywhere that might grant access to official seals and witness documents. His list eventually contained over 400 names, and he investigated each one methodically, searching for connections to the impossible documents, for gaps in their documented histories that might hide secret activities. One name kept appearing in peripheral ways that made Brennan uneasy, though he could never prove a direct connection. Catherine Vance, a woman who worked as a legal secretary in Raleigh from 1889 until her death in 1925, employed by 3 different law firms over her career, all of which handled property deeds, marriage contracts, and estate documents. She never married, lived alone in a boarding house on Dawson Street, and was described in contemporary accounts as extremely private and exceptionally competent. She traveled frequently, taking the train to visit family in Virginia, though records showed her family had died by 1895, raising questions about where she actually went during those trips. Her signature appeared as a witness on hundreds of legitimate documents throughout her career, always neat and professional, but never on any of the 23 impossible ones. She died on a Wednesday in April 1925, 5 months after the letter was dated, and was buried in Oakwood Cemetery under a simple stone that listed no family, no relationships, just her name and years. Brennan visited her grave multiple times, standing among the oaks and granite markers, trying to imagine if this quiet, forgotten woman could have orchestrated decades of perfect deception. There was no proof, nothing beyond circumstantial timing and professional access, but her name began with K. Her middle name was Catherine, and the initial could easily have been hers. But there was another detail that made Brennan doubt his own theory, a detail so strange that he almost didn't include it in his notes. Catherine Vance appeared in one of the impossible documents, not as a subject or a bride or a property owner, but as a witness to a birth certificate from 1919, her signature clear and unmistakable. The same precise handwriting that appeared on dozens of legitimate documents throughout the archives. But according to law firm records, Catherine was in Richmond, Virginia, on the exact date of that birth, attending a legal conference with 3 partners who all confirmed her presence in signed affidavits. She couldn't have been in Raleigh to witness a birth she wasn't present for, yet there was her signature, authenticated and genuine. If she was Kay, the author of the confession letter, why would she include herself among the impossible witnesses, creating a paradox that implicated her own identity? Unless that was the point, unless she wanted to be part of the mystery, to exist simultaneously in the role of creator and creation, to blur the line between architect and evidence so thoroughly that even discovering her name wouldn't solve anything. Brennan considered that perhaps the entire confession letter was misdirection, that Kay wasn't one person, but multiple people working across generations, that the impossible documents were created by a group with access to archives, and a shared purpose that remained hidden. He investigated secret societies active in Raleigh during that period, Freemasons, Oddfellows, fraternal organizations that valued ritual and secrecy, but found no evidence they engaged in document forgery or archival manipulation. The more he searched, the more the mystery expanded, like pulling a thread that unraveled an entire tapestry without revealing the pattern beneath. Every answer led to more questions. Every suspect eliminated opened new possibilities, and the 23 documents sat in their climate-controlled storage, perfect and impossible, waiting for an explanation that never came. Some researchers theorized that the documents were test cases created by the government to evaluate archival security, planted deliberately to see if anyone would notice, but no federal or state agency ever claimed responsibility, and the elaborate nature of the deception seemed far beyond bureaucratic testing methods. Others suggested the documents were evidence of time travel or alternate realities bleeding into recorded history, theories that were dismissed as fringe speculation but never entirely disproven by the physical evidence. The simplest explanation, that one person with knowledge, access, and patience had created false records over 50 years, seemed simultaneously the most logical and the most impossible, a paradox that defined the entire investigation. In 2022, a graduate student at North Carolina State University discovered something that reignited the investigation with new intensity. She was researching Southern Railway employment records for her thesis on labor history when she found a personnel file for a conductor named William Garrett, who worked the Washington to Atlanta route from 1868 until his retirement in 1924. His file contained the usual documentation, hire dates, salary records, performance reviews, but it also included a curious note from a supervisor in 1923 complaining that Garrett had made unauthorized stops in Raleigh for several minutes on Tuesday mornings. Over the years, claiming he needed to drop off personal mail at the post office. The supervisor noted this was against company policy, but hadn't disciplined Garrett because he was nearing retirement and had an otherwise spotless record. The note mentioned that Garrett always insisted on making these stops on Tuesdays, refusing to adjust his schedule, and that he'd been doing this since at least 1890 based on older log entries. When the student cross-referenced the dates of Garrett's Tuesday stops with the dates of the impossible documents, she found they matched perfectly, every single one, down to the year and day of the week. William Garrett died in 1926 in a veteran's home in Virginia with no living family and few personal effects. His obituary described him as a quiet man who loved trains and kept to himself, a bachelor who spent his retirement reading and walking along railway tracks, sometimes standing for hours watching trains pass. There was no mention of any connection to Raleigh beyond his route, no indication he knew Catherine Vance or anyone else involved in legal or archival work. But his personnel file listed his full name as William Kenneth Garrett, and his signature on employment documents matched the formal, precise handwriting in the confession letter. The initial K could have been his middle name, Kenneth, a detail he rarely used in daily life but might have chosen for a secret project spanning decades. Researchers immediately began investigating whether Garrett had any relationship with Catherine Vance, whether they'd known each other, worked together, or shared any connection beyond the coincidence of matching initials. They found no evidence of contact, no letters between them, no witness accounts placing them in the same location, no financial transactions or shared acquaintances. But both had access to the systems that would make the impossible documents possible, Vance through her legal work and Garrett through his regular presence in Raleigh on the exact days everything was filed. Were they working together, two people with the patience and skill to execute a 50-year deception? Or was this another layer of coincidence? Two separate individuals with the same initial who happened to intersect with the mystery in ways that suggested connection but proved nothing. The investigation team debated these questions endlessly, with some convinced Garrett was K and acting alone, others certain Vance was the architect, and a few holding out for the theory that they were partners in an elaborate scheme whose purpose remained unknown. One researcher suggested that perhaps they didn't even know each other, that they were both following instructions from a third party, someone who orchestrated the entire project from a distance and used Garrett's train schedule and Vance's legal access as convenient tools. But that theory required an even more elaborate conspiracy, one that seemed to grow more complex with every new piece of evidence, and eventually the team acknowledged they might never know the full truth. The confession letter promised that Kay would be gone from this world, suggesting death, but it didn't specify when. If Garrett was Kay, he lived 2 years after the letter was dated, plenty of time to watch for reactions, to see if anyone discovered his work. If Vance was Kay, she lived even longer, 5 months past the letter's date, enough time to observe whether her confession sparked investigations or remained buried in miscellaneous correspondence. Neither showed any signs of acknowledgement in their final years. No deathbed confessions, no hints to friends or colleagues, nothing in their wills or personal effects that referenced the documents or the mystery. They died as they lived, quietly, leaving behind only routine traces of ordinary lives, while the impossible records they may have created continued to perplex researchers who discovered them nearly a century later. The mystery became a case study in archival science programs, a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of historical records, and a reminder that even the most trusted systems can be manipulated by someone with sufficient knowledge and patience. But the strangest detail wasn't discovered until 2023, when a researcher noticed something no one had checked before. The 23 impossible documents all listed people who were alive and documented elsewhere when they were supposedly in Raleigh, but no one had investigated what happened to those people after the documents were created. The researcher began tracking the real individuals, following their lives forward from the dates they appeared in Raleigh records, searching for any unusual events, sudden changes, unexplained deaths, anything that might connect them to the mystery beyond their names appearing in impossible places. What she found was a pattern so subtle it had been invisible for a century, a pattern that suggested the documents weren't random insertions but carefully chosen selections based on criteria no one had considered. Every single person listed in the impossible documents died within 5 years of their name appearing in Raleigh records. Everyone, without exception, across all 23 documents. Catherine Doris, the bride from the 1891 marriage certificate, died in 1895 in Chicago, cause listed as influenza, buried in a cemetery that still exists with her headstone intact. The man who supposedly bought property in 1878 died in 1882. Drowning accident in Tennessee, witnessed by 3 people who swore he fell from a boat while fishing. The woman who voted in 1912 before she was born died in 1924 at age 4, scarlet fever, death certificate signed by a Boston doctor. The pattern held across decades. Every impossible name followed by death within a 5-year window. Some from illness, some from accidents, a few from old age, all documented and verified in contemporary records. The deaths appeared natural, random, spread across different locations with no obvious connection between them except the timing. Was it coincidence, a sample size too small to be statistically significant, or evidence that whoever created the documents was choosing victims who would die soon, ensuring their impossible presence in Raleigh records would be buried with them, never questioned or discovered during their lifetimes? That theory suggested Kay had access not just to archives and legal documents, but to medical information or personal knowledge that allowed predicting death within a specific time frame. It suggested surveillance, study, intimate knowledge of strangers' lives and vulnerabilities. One researcher proposed that Kay might have been targeting people who were already ill, tracking newspaper obituary announcements backward to find those who died young or unexpectedly, then inserting their names into Raleigh records dated before their deaths. But that didn't explain how Kay obtained detailed biographical information, middle names, parent names, occupations, all accurate details that appeared in the impossible documents alongside the false location. It suggested Kay was creating records for people they'd researched extensively, people they knew would die before anyone might question why their name appeared in a North Carolina archive when they'd never left Massachusetts or Tennessee or Illinois. The 5-year death pattern changed everything about how researchers understood the mystery, transforming it from a puzzle about archival integrity into something darker, a project that seemed to require intimate knowledge of mortality and the ability to predict or select deaths with disturbing accuracy. Michael Brennan, reviewing this new evidence in his retirement, felt the same stomach-dropping sensation he'd experienced when he first discovered the Doris certificate. If Kay was choosing names based on impending death, that required either supernatural foresight or access to medical information that wouldn't be centralized or accessible until decades after the documents were created. But the pattern was undeniable. 23 names, 23 deaths within 5 years. A correlation so strong it couldn't be random chance. Brennan began investigating whether Catherine Vance or William Garrett had any connection to medical fields, to hospitals, to physicians who might share information about terminal patients, but found nothing. Vance worked in law offices, Garrett conducted trains. Neither had documented connections to healthcare or mortality records. Unless Kay wasn't selecting people who were about to die, but causing their deaths somehow. A theory so disturbing that researchers hesitated to voice it openly. Could one person, working alone across 5 decades, arrange 23 deaths in different cities, using different methods, never caught or suspected? The idea seemed impossible, requiring resources and reach far beyond what a legal secretary or train conductor could command. Yet the pattern existed, documented in death certificates and obituaries, a silent trail of mortality following every impossible name like a shadow no one had noticed until the right question was asked. Some researchers argued that the deaths were retroactively selected, that Kay combed through old obituaries and chose people who had already died, then backdated documents to appear before their deaths, creating the illusion of prediction when it was really just careful selection from historical records. But that theory didn't account for the timing precision, the fact that documents were filed on specific Tuesdays matching train schedules, or the confession letter's claim of real-time insertion spanning decades. The investigation reached an impasse where every explanation seemed both possible and impossible, where evidence pointed in multiple directions without converging on a single truth. In late 2023, the North Carolina State Archives quietly announced they'd found 12 more impossible documents, bringing the total to 35, all following the same pattern, all filed on Tuesdays when the Southern Railway's number 97 stopped in Raleigh, all listing people who were documented elsewhere and died within 5 years. The new discoveries included records from as early as 1867 and as late as 1929, extending the mystery beyond the time frame established by the original 23 documents. If Garrett and Vance were involved, the extended dates challenged theories about their exclusive responsibility, since both were too young in 1867, and Garrett had died by 1926, 3 years before the latest document. Either more people were involved, the project continued after the original architects died, or the dating of the newly discovered documents was wrong, possibilities that each opened new investigative paths without providing clear answers. The archives stopped short of releasing the new documents publicly, citing ongoing authentication testing, but leaked details confirmed they matched the same impossible pattern, same precision, same care, same deliberate insertion into a system designed to preserve truth. Researchers who'd spent years on the case began to acknowledge they might never solve it completely, that Kay's identity might remain forever obscured by time, death, and the destruction of evidence that occurs naturally over a century. But they also recognized that the mystery itself had revealed something valuable about how history is constructed and preserved, how much faith we place in records and official documents, and how vulnerable even the most careful systems are to patient, intelligent manipulation. The impossible documents prove that one person, or a small group working across decades, could insert false information into the permanent record of American history and have it accepted as truth for nearly 100 years before anyone noticed. They proved that archives are only as reliable as the people who create and maintain them, and that the past we think we know is built on assumptions of integrity that can be violated without detection. Kay's work, whether art project, philosophical statement, or something darker, forced archivists to reconsider security measures, verification processes, and the possibility that other impossible records might exist in collections around the country, waiting to be discovered. In 2024, Michael Brennan published a book about the case, titled The Tuesday Papers, which detailed every aspect of the investigation while avoiding definitive conclusions about Kay's identity. The book became required reading in archival science programs and sparked renewed interest in auditing historical records for similar anomalies. Several archives across the United States began their own reviews, searching for patterns of impossible documentation, and a few reported finding suspicious records that couldn't be immediately verified, though none matched the scale or precision of the Raleigh documents. Brennan appeared on podcasts and at conferences, always careful to present the mystery as unsolved rather than promoting any single theory, acknowledging the limits of what evidence could prove. He died in early 2025, heart attack in his sleep, leaving behind filing cabinets full of notes and theories, none providing the conclusive answer he'd spent years pursuing. His obituary mentioned his discovery of the impossible documents, crediting him with one of the most significant archival mysteries in American history, a legacy built on noticing what everyone else had missed. The confession letter from Kay remains in its sealed folder, accessible but unread by most, a testament to either genuine authorship or elaborate deception that no test can definitively prove. The handwriting has been analyzed by experts who claim it matches characteristics of someone born in the 1850s and educated in formal penmanship, consistent with both Garrett and Vance's generation, but also consistent with thousands of other people from that era. The paper and ink date correctly, but provide no unique markers that might identify their source. The content reads like a manifesto from someone proud of their work, confident in their methods, amused by the idea of future discovery. Whether Kay was one person or many, whether they acted from philosophical conviction or personal obsession, whether they continued their work beyond 1929 or stopped for reasons unknown, these questions remain unanswered, wrapped in the same mystery that surrounded the documents when they were first discovered. The letter promises that Kay's name won't be found among the 23 impossible records, but it doesn't promise their name won't be found elsewhere, in witness signatures, in correspondence, in employment records, somewhere in the vast ocean of documentation, that makes up American archival history. Some mysteries grow deeper the more you investigate them, revealing layers that suggest truth while providing no proof, opening questions that can't be closed with evidence alone. Catherine Vance's grave in Oakwood Cemetery receives occasional visitors now, researchers and true crime enthusiasts who place flowers on the headstone of a woman who might have been Kay, or might have been just another legal secretary whose life happened to intersect with a mystery in ways that suggested involvement without proving it. William Garrett has no grave marker that anyone can find. His final resting place in a veterans' cemetery lost to time and poor record-keeping. Another ghost in a story full of them. The 23 original documents, now 35, remain in secure storage, removed from public access, but preserved for future researchers who might develop new methods of analysis, new ways of understanding what Kay created and why. The names listed in those documents, Catherine Doris and all the others, exist in two realities simultaneously. Their true lives documented in the cities where they actually lived, and their impossible lives recorded in Raleigh where they never set foot. Parallel histories that should never have intersected but did, thanks to someone with patience, access, and a purpose we may never fully understand. The Southern Railway's number 97 stopped running its Washington to Atlanta route in 1951, replaced by faster trains and eventually by interstate highways that made rail travel less central to American life. The tracks still run through Raleigh, but the station where the train stopped on those crucial Tuesdays has been renovated multiple times. Its original waiting rooms and platforms replaced with modern construction that holds no memory of whoever might have stepped off a train with documents in hand, walked to offices on nearby streets, filed papers that would perplex people a century later. If you stand at the current station on a Tuesday morning, you can imagine what it might have looked like in 1891 or 1912 or 1924. The steam and noise, the passengers rushing between trains, the brief window when someone could arrive, conduct mysterious business, and leave before their presence was memorable. But imagination isn't evidence, and the train schedule that seems so important to understanding Kay's methods might have been coincidental, a pattern humans impose on random events because our minds crave connections even where none exist. The real question isn't who Kay was, though that remains endlessly fascinating to researchers who dedicate careers to pursuing shadows through archival records. The real question is why. What motivated someone to spend decades creating perfect forgeries that served no obvious purpose, that enriched no one, that changed no historical narratives or political outcomes? The documents didn't make anyone famous, didn't alter property ownership in meaningful ways, didn't affect anyone's inheritance or legal rights. They existed purely as insertions, false information planted in a true system, and the only apparent purpose was the act itself, the proof that it could be done, the demonstration that history is more fragile than we want to believe. Kay's confession letter suggests this was the point, that the documents were meant to be discovered eventually, to serve as evidence that our trust in official records isn't fully justified. That the past we preserve in archives is only as reliable as our ability to verify every signature, every witness, every detail against multiple sources. In that sense, Kay succeeded completely, forcing archival science to evolve, to question assumptions, to implement security measures that might prevent future insertions even if they can't explain the past ones. But there's something else in the letter, a tone that suggests satisfaction, even joy, in the work itself. In the careful research required to select the right names, forge the right signatures, time everything to align with train schedules and Tuesday mornings. Kay sounds like an artist describing their masterpiece, someone who took pleasure in the craft of deception, in the knowledge that their work would be invisible for decades before emerging as a mystery that would perplex people who valued truth and accuracy. There's no malice in the letter, no anger or resentment toward the archival system. Just quiet confidence, and what feels like genuine affection for the challenge of doing something difficult and doing it perfectly. That emotional quality makes some researchers believe the letter is genuine, that Kay was real and writing from experience, because the tone carries authenticity that's hard to fake, a sense of personal investment in work that consumed decades of secret effort. But emotional authenticity can be performed as easily as facts can be forged, and the letter might be Kay's final deception, a false confession designed to mislead investigators, even as it appears to explain everything. The truth about the impossible documents might be simpler than any theory suggests, or far stranger than anyone has imagined, and the evidence available might never be sufficient to choose between possibilities. That ambiguity is maddening to researchers trained to solve puzzles through systematic analysis. But it's also what makes the mystery compelling to wider audiences who encounter it through books, articles, and documentaries. The story of Kay and the Tuesday Papers taps into something fundamental about how we relate to history. Our desire for truth mixed with our fascination with deception, our need for answers balanced against our love of unsolved mysteries. People want to believe Catherine Vance was Kay because it makes a better story. A woman working in shadows of legal offices, using her position to execute a decades-long project no one suspected, dying quietly with her secret intact. Or they want to believe William Garrett was responsible, a lonely conductor whose regular route became the framework for elaborate insertions, a man who loved trains and used their schedules to structure his hidden life's work. Both stories satisfy narrative expectations while remaining unproven, and that tension between satisfying story and insufficient evidence defines the entire case. What if the truth is that Kay was neither of them, or both of them working together, or someone else entirely whose name appears nowhere in the investigation? What if the documents were created by multiple people across 3 generations, each adding to a project started by someone long dead, a legacy passed down through secret communication we'll never find? What if Kay is still alive, an old person in their 90s now, reading articles about the discovery and smiling at theories that come close but never quite arrive at truth? These possibilities remain open because nothing has been definitively proven, and maybe that's exactly what Kay wanted. To create a mystery so perfect it would never be completely solved, where every answer generates new questions and the search for truth becomes an endless loop. The confession letter's final sentence promises that Kay will be gone from this world, but it doesn't specify when that departure happened, and the ambiguity leaves room for the possibility that Kay watched the discovery unfold, saw researchers debate theories, and enjoyed the spectacle of smart people struggling with a puzzle designed to resist solution. In 2025, the North Carolina State Archives implemented new security protocols based on lessons learned from the impossible documents, requiring multiple verification steps for any record insertion, cross-referencing signatures against authenticated samples, flagging any document that shows geographic inconsistencies with other known records. These measures won't prevent someone with Kay's level of skill and patience from trying again, but they'll make it significantly harder, requiring even more sophisticated methods and longer time frames. Some archivists wonder if that's Kay's real legacy, not the mystery itself, but the improvements to archival security that resulted from discovering the deception, a gift disguised as a violation, forcing systems to evolve and strengthen against threats they hadn't imagined. If that was Kay's intention, it suggests a mind that thought in terms of long-term impacts, of using deception to improve truth-keeping systems, a paradox that feels appropriate for someone who spent decades creating perfect lies within institutions dedicated to preserving facts. The 5-year death pattern continues to disturb researchers who understand its implications. The suggestion that Kay either predicted mortality with impossible accuracy or selected victims based on knowledge of their impending deaths. No evidence has emerged to suggest Kay caused any deaths directly, and the working theory remains that the deaths were either coincidental or that Kay selected names from people who were already ill, tracking obituaries and medical records backward to find suitable candidates. But that theory requires access to information that wasn't centralized in the 1890s through 1920s. When medical privacy laws barely existed, but information sharing between cities and states was limited by communication technology. How would someone in Raleigh know that a woman in Boston was terminally ill in time to create a document before her death? How would they access private medical records from multiple states across multiple decades without leaving any trail of inquiries or requests? These questions remain unanswered, and the death pattern stands as perhaps the most unsettling aspect of a case already full of impossible elements. Unless the pattern is coincidence, a statistical artifact that appears meaningful but results from chance applied to a small sample size, 35 people dying within 5 years of documents being created when life expectancy in that era was shorter and medical care less advanced. Some statisticians argue the pattern isn't as significant as it appears, that given the time period and the number of documents, having most people die within 5 years falls within expected probability ranges. But other statisticians counter that having all 35 deaths fall within the 5-year window, with none exceeding it, suggests selection rather than chance, a boundary too clean to be random. The debate continues in academic papers and conference presentations, with no consensus emerging, another aspect of the mystery that refuses to resolve into certainty. Kay might have been selecting for death, or researchers might be seeing patterns in randomness, because the human mind is designed to find meaning, even in coincidence, and distinguishing between these possibilities requires more data than exists or can ever be recovered from a century-old trail of evidence. The current generation of researchers studying the Tuesday papers acknowledges they're working with incomplete information, with physical evidence that raises more questions than it answers, with theories that fit some facts while contradicting others. They've learned to live with ambiguity, to present findings as provisional rather than conclusive, to acknowledge when evidence runs out and speculation begins. This humility represents a shift from earlier investigators who believed enough analysis would crack the case, who thought Kay's identity was discoverable through sufficient effort and proper methodology. The shift reflects both frustration with lack of progress and acceptance that some mysteries might be designed to resist solution, that Kay might have been skilled enough or lucky enough to create a puzzle with no complete answer, where every piece of evidence leads toward truth without quite reaching it. That possibility bothers some researchers who dedicated years to the case, but it also provides a kind of closure, accepting that the mystery itself might be the final answer, that Kay's real achievement was creating something that would perplex and fascinate people a century later without ever fully revealing itself. The documents themselves remain the most concrete evidence, 35 pieces of paper and ink that exist physically and can be examined, tested, authenticated, but never fully explained. They're beautiful in their precision, perfect forgeries or perfect insertions depending on terminology, each one carefully crafted to match period standards and pass verification tests that wouldn't be developed until decades after their creation. Looking at them in the controlled environment of the archives, behind glass or in protective folders, it's easy to appreciate them as art objects independent of their mysterious origins, to admire the handwriting, the attention to detail, the commitment to craft that made them indistinguishable from legitimate records. Kay was an artist in that sense, someone who worked in paper and ink and official seals, whose medium was archival documentation and whose canvas was the permanent record of American history. The fact that we may never know their identity or full motivation doesn't diminish the achievement, the decades of patient work, the technical skill required to execute the project without detection, the boldness of imagining such a plan and following through across a significant portion of a human lifetime. Some descendants of the people listed in the impossible documents have been contacted by researchers seeking any family stories that might explain the connection to Raleigh, any mention of mysterious trips to North Carolina, any letters or diaries that reference the events documented in the false records. None have been found. The families have no knowledge of Raleigh connections and no explanation for why their ancestors' names appear in records from a city they never visited. A few descendants were upset by the implications that their family history had been tampered with, concerned about what other false information might exist in archives, worried that genealogical research they'd trusted might contain errors they'd never detect. Others were fascinated, treating the mystery as an interesting historical footnote, a strange coincidence that connected their family to something larger and more mysterious than ordinary life. One descendant of Catherine Doris traveled to Raleigh to visit the archives and see the false marriage certificate bearing her great-great-grandmother's name, standing in the climate-controlled room where it was stored, trying to imagine why someone would create this document, what it meant, whether her ancestor somehow knew about it or remained forever unaware that her name lived in two histories simultaneously. That question of awareness haunts the case, whether the people listed in the impossible documents ever knew their names were being used, Whether Kay contacted them somehow, explained the project, gained their permission, or simply took what was needed without asking. The lack of any contemporary account suggesting people discovered false records bearing their names suggests they remained unaware, that Kay worked in secrecy not just from archivists, but from the very people whose identities were borrowed for the project. That raises ethical questions about consent and identity, about whether using someone's real name in false contexts violates something fundamental about their personhood, even if it causes no practical harm. Kay's letter doesn't address this, doesn't acknowledge any ethical considerations about the people chosen for inclusion in the impossible documents, and that absence might reveal something about Kay's worldview, a perspective that saw people as names and data points rather than individuals with rights to their own identities. Or perhaps Kay simply didn't consider the ethical implications, so focused on the technical challenge and philosophical point that questions of consent never entered the calculation. The mystery has inspired fiction, novels, and short stories that imagine various solutions, creating versions of Kay with motivations ranging from revenge to love, to madness, to philosophical inquiry. Some writers portray Kay as a tragic figure, someone driven to create the documents by loss or injustice, using forgery as a way to rewrite painful history or preserve memories that official records ignored. Others imagine Kay as a trickster, someone who enjoyed deception for its own sake and found satisfaction in outwitting systems designed to prevent exactly what they accomplished. A few present Kay as a time traveler or supernatural entity, the only explanation that seems to account for the impossible predictions and perfect execution across decades. These fictional explorations don't solve the real mystery, but they reveal how the case has captured public imagination, becoming a framework for exploring questions about truth, identity, history, and the reliability of the records we trust to preserve the past. The real Kay, whoever they were, has become a symbol for the vulnerability of historical truth, a reminder that what we think we know about the past depends on the integrity of systems maintained by fallible humans who can be deceived or corrupted, or simply make mistakes that compound over time. If you're still listening, subscribe to this channel because some stories don't end when the evidence runs out. They continue in the questions they leave behind, in the patterns that suggest truth without proving it, in the spaces between what we know and what we can never fully understand. The Tuesday papers remain in their storage folders in Raleigh, waiting for new researchers with new methods who might discover something previous investigators missed, some detail or pattern or connection that finally reveals Kay's identity and motivation with certainty that can't be disputed. That possibility seems increasingly remote as years pass, and the people who might have known Kay personally fade from living memory into historical record themselves, becoming names in archives just like the impossible names Kay inserted decades ago. But archival science continues to develop new techniques, new ways of analyzing historical documents, and perhaps someday, a test will reveal something in the ink, or paper, or handwriting that points definitively toward one person or another, closing the case that has remained open for over a century of secret existence and 5 years of active investigation. Until then, the mystery endures, perfect in its ambiguity, satisfying in its resistance to easy answers, a puzzle that respects the intelligence of those trying to solve it by refusing to yield to anything less than proof that doesn't yet exist and may never be found. The last known impossible document was dated Tuesday, March 17, 1929, filed in the Wake County Archives on a morning when the Southern Railway's number 97 stopped at Raleigh Station for 11 minutes before continuing south toward Atlanta. The document records a property transfer that never happened, listing a man who was living in Philadelphia at the time, signed by witnesses who existed, and a notary whose seal was genuine, all details perfect, except the fundamental truth of the transaction. Researchers have studied this final document extensively, looking for differences that might distinguish it from the earlier ones, signs that Kay's methods were changing or that someone else had taken over the project. They found nothing unusual, the same precision and care, the same attention to detail that characterized all 35 documents, suggesting continuity rather than change, consistency rather than evolution. If this was truly the last document, if Kay stopped after March 1929 and never created another insertion, that timing might be significant, connected to the stock market crash later that year, to personal circumstances that changed, to age or illness, or simply the decision that the project had accomplished its purpose and needed no further additions. Or perhaps there are more documents still undiscovered, hiding in archives that haven't been digitized or carefully audited, waiting for the same kind of accidental discovery that revealed the original 23. The possibility that impossible records exist in other cities, other states, other archival collections, creates a strange tension for researchers who want to find them and simultaneously hope they don't exist, who want Kay's work to be contained and finished, rather than ongoing and undetected. Some archivists have begun searching their own collections with new awareness, looking for the same patterns, Tuesday filings, geographic inconsistencies, authenticated documents that feel slightly wrong in ways they can't immediately articulate. A few have found suspicious records that remain under investigation, though none have been conclusively connected to Kay or proven to be impossible insertions rather than legitimate documentation with unusual characteristics. The search continues, expanding from Raleigh to a nationwide audit that may take decades to complete, if it ever does, given the vast number of historical documents stored in archives across America. Michael Brennan's last note, written days before his death, expressed hope that the mystery would eventually be solved, but acknowledged he wouldn't live to see it happen. He wrote that the Tuesday papers had taught him humility about the limits of evidence and the persistence of uncertainty. The decades of investigation had shown him how much we don't know about the past, despite the documentation we've preserved. He thanked Kay, whoever they were, for creating a mystery that forced him to think differently about archives and truth, even if the frustration of never solving it completely had cost him countless hours and considerable peace of mind. The note ended with a suggestion for future researchers, that they should focus less on Kay's identity and more on what the documents reveal about the construction of historical truth, about how we decide what's real and what's false, when physical evidence can be manipulated by someone with sufficient skill and patience. That shift in focus, from solving the mystery to understanding what it teaches us, represents the final evolution in how researchers approach the case, accepting that the lesson might be more valuable than the answer, that the questions Kay raised might be more important than discovering who raised them. The confession letter promised that Kay's work would prove history is fragile, that records can be trusted until they cannot, and in that sense the mission succeeded completely regardless of whether Kay's identity is ever confirmed. Every archivist who works with historical documents now approaches them with slightly more skepticism, slightly more awareness that authenticity tests can be passed by skilled forgers, that verification processes can be defeated by patient manipulation over long periods. That vigilance is Kay's legacy, a permanent change in how archives operate, how documents are authenticated, how much trust we place in systems that previous generations assumed were secure against sophisticated internal deception. The cost was 35 false records inserted into American history, names of real people placed in contexts where they never existed, small corruptions in the vast database of the past that don't change major historical narratives but prove the concept that such changes are possible. Future historians reading those records without knowledge of the investigation might accept them as truth, citing them in research, building conclusions on false foundations, spreading the deception forward through time as each error compounds into larger misunderstandings. Unless the documents remain flagged in perpetuity, marked with warnings that they're disputed or known forgeries, preserved as evidence of the mystery, but clearly labeled to prevent anyone from treating them as legitimate sources. The archives have implemented such markers, but digital systems change, databases migrate to new platforms, and there's no guarantee the warnings will survive across centuries the way the documents themselves might. Kay might have understood this, might have anticipated that the forgeries would eventually be accepted as truth once the people who discovered them died and institutional memory faded, that the impossible documents would be rehabilitated into the historical record through simple persistence and the passage of time. That possibility adds another layer to Kay's potential motivations. The idea that this wasn't just about proving vulnerability, but about actually changing history in small ways, inserting false information that would eventually be accepted as real, creating a legacy that outlives the mystery and becomes indistinguishable from truth. In that scenario, Kay wins by waiting, by surviving as data long after the investigation concludes and public interest moves to other mysteries, letting time do what immediate deception couldn't, eroding skepticism until the false becomes real through sheer longevity. That thought keeps some researchers awake at night. The possibility that Kay's work continues to unfold according to a plan that operates on timescales beyond human lifespans, that we're all participating in an experiment whose final results won't be known for another century or more. It's paranoid thinking, perhaps, but the Tuesday papers have taught everyone involved that paranoia is sometimes justified, that impossible things do happen when someone with vision and patience commits to making them real. Kay exists in that uncertain space between confirmed and imagined, between documented and speculative. A figure who might have been one person or many, who might have stopped in 1929 or continued in ways we haven't detected, whose motivations might have been philosophical or personal or something we lack the framework to understand. The mystery is perfect because it refuses to resolve, because every investigation circles back to the same evidence that can be interpreted multiple ways without definitive proof choosing between them, because Kay designed it that way, or because reality sometimes creates puzzles that don't have solutions, no matter how much we want them to exist. The final truth might be that there is no final truth, that the Tuesday papers will remain forever in that liminal space between solved and unsolved, explained and mysterious, real and impossible. That outcome satisfies no one completely, but it honors the complexity of what Kay created. The care and attention that went into building a mystery that could survive a century of investigation and technological advancement without yielding all its secrets. If Kay is watching from wherever the dead go, if consciousness persists and can observe the living world, they must be satisfied with how their work has endured, how it continues to perplex and fascinate people who approach it with the best tools and methods available to contemporary science. That satisfaction is earned, the result of decades of patient work done in secret with no immediate reward. Only the faith that someday, long after Kay was gone, someone would notice what had been built and recognize it as something remarkable, something that challenged assumptions and forced questions about the nature of truth and memory, and the fragility of historical certainty. In Raleigh, on quiet Tuesday mornings, if you stand at the place where the old railway station used to be, you can almost imagine the sound of trains arriving and departing, the brief chaos of passengers and freight, the moments when someone might have stepped off carrying documents in a leather case, walking with purpose toward offices a few blocks away, filing papers that would outlive them by a century and counting, creating ripples in time that we're still trying to understand. Still trying to measure, still trying to explain in ways that make sense of the impossible. And one truth remains absolutely certain. After all these years of investigation and analysis and debate, whoever Kay was, whatever they wanted, they succeeded in creating something that will outlast everyone who ever tried to solve it. A mystery that lives in official records and academic papers and conversations between researchers who've dedicated careers to chasing shadows through archives. And maybe that immortality through mystery was the point all along. Maybe Kay understood that the only way to truly live forever is to become a question that can never be completely answered, a name that exists primarily as an absence, a presence felt most strongly in the spaces between what we know and what we can only wonder about. Some questions echo louder than any answer ever could, and the name Kay continues to whisper through the halls of American archives, a reminder that history is written by those patient enough to wait for their truth to be discovered.